Take it over to 45. Leave it on the album.
Hey, this is Tommy Stewart Stazeski from Tom Stewart Drums. Welcome to my YouTube channel, where on this video we are going to discuss rock magazines from the 70s and the 80s. Some of these survived into the 90s and beyond. Some of them are still around, and but many of them I haven't. I don't continue to buy them because they cover newer artists, which I don't really care about. So my main discussion on this is going to be focused on the heyday of the rock magazine, which was basically the 70s into the 80s, before the internet, before there was digital media. Really, it was just about having a trip to the newsstand or to 7-Eleven or Wawa or whatever the local convenience store was in your area, and flipping through the magazine racks or the bookstore or wherever you could find magazines at, and just really having a fun time looking through all the magazines that used to be around back then. Today there are a lot more magazines. As far as like getting at Barnes and Noble or something, there's a huge magazine racks, and there's a ton of music magazines, but a lot of them are British. You have stuff like Mojo, Uncut, and Classic Rock Magazine, which is awesome. I've been a subscriber to that forever, and that's not going to be part of this conversation because that's a newer rock magazine. This is really about back in the day. Rock Candy Magazine's another one. There's a few that I will still pick up occasionally, that I don't subscribe to, like things like Rock Candy and stuff like that, depending on what the cover story is and things like that. But Classic Rock Magazine has always been pretty consistent for a really long time. They have pretty decent record reviews in there. Some of them are brief, some of them are in depth, a lot of good cover stories. And I actually subscribe to Creem Magazine, which is the title of this video, Why Creem Magazine Ruled. And I'm talking about the heyday of Creem Magazine, which was the 70s into like the mid to late 80s, actually. We're going to get into Creem later on. I do subscribe to Creem now. They've revived the magazine. And if I'm being honest, I subscribed to it out of loyalty to the brand, but I was kind of disappointed in most of the subject matter that they cover in the magazine. It's very much geared towards obscure, hardcore, punk, alt rock, like bands that I don't really listen to or care about. And I get that they're trying to remain sort of like a cutting edge kind of thing, like they were back in the day. They were covering, current bands in the 70s and 80s, but they did it in a cutting edge sort of way, very sarcastic and biting commentary and funny and off-color sort of jokes and strange reviews. And we'll get more into detail about the pros and cons of Creem Magazine later in this video, but I was hoping Creem Magazine now was going to model itself more after like what Classic Rock does, which is current look backs at classic albums and studio sessions and just bands from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, current interviews with those members, discussing tours and things, mixed in with, if you want to throw in, like Classic Rock will throw in some articles on some newer up-and-coming bands like, I don't know, like Dirty Honey or, Rival Sons that are popular right now overseas. Just, they'll sprinkle that stuff in, but the main thrust of Classic Rock Magazine is looking back at classic rock. And I was kind of hoping Creem would do that, because Creem could also go deep into new wave and punk of the day, the 70s and 80s. They could revisit a lot of stuff from like Elvis Costello and Rockpile and, Squeeze and the Knack and Raspberries or whatever of that, the Cars. There's a lot of stuff that they could do that classic rock magazine doesn't really do, because classic rock is more geared towards the hard rock and the heavy metal stuff. But Creem hasn't decided to go that way, so I've remained a subscriber to it, and I leaf through it when I get it, but it's not what I was hoping it was going to be, unfortunately. I don't want to deter anybody from checking it out, but you can pick up issues of it on eBay if you don't want to subscribe. You just want to buy an issue. But yeah, we'll get into the heyday of Creem later on, but for now we're going to discuss the rock magazines of the 70s and 80s and how fun it was to go to the newsstand and pick them up. And, back then there was not as many as there are now. There was the standards, which in the 70s would be like Creem, Circus, Hit Parader, Record Review, Musician Magazine, Rolling Stone, of course. Oh. Rolling Stone's always sucked. It's a bunch of elitist tastemaker bullshit with an agenda, trying to be hip. Everybody knows. I mean, anybody that has any sort of grasp on reality and isn't caught up in all of that nonsense of, I'm going to list my top 25 guitarists, and 10 of them are going to be these obscure motherfuckers that nobody's ever heard of because I want to look like I'm in the know, and everybody else is behind the curve. And it's that kind of just stupid bullshit that has always been annoying about Rolling Stone. You have top 25 guitarists or top 50 guitarists or even top 100 guitarists. And you've got, I don't know, Kurt Cobain on the list. It's not a knock on Kurt Cobain as an artist or a songwriter or a groundbreaking person, musician that had made a huge difference in music. But we're talking about guitarists. And you don't have fucking Michael Schenker. There's a list of a bazillion guitar players that are not on this list. It's an agenda-driven magazine with the politics and stuff like that. And I get social commentary, and that's what they do and all that. And that whatever side you're on, that doesn't matter to me. But never liked Rolling Stone. Just a bunch of snobs. We'll just leave it at that. And then you had in the 70s when I was growing up, besides the mainstream rock magazines, you started to see a lot of, we're going to stick to the 70s right now. You started to see a lot of these like cheap shit rock magazines, hack job stuff thrown together just to capitalize on the popularity of whoever was, selling records at the moment. Magazines like Rock and Super Rock, I'll be putting pictures of some of the covers of these magazines up so you can see what I'm talking about. And a lot of these magazines would run like sensationalist like headlines like, is Paul Stanley dead? Or Meatloaf versus Led Zeppelin. Just fluff bullshit articles that were probably written in 5 minutes. No substance, no legitimate interviews, nothing. It was just a few pages of some glossy concert photos, which sometimes were actually pretty good photos. There was a lot of these super rock and rock magazines would always have Kiss on the cover in the 70s, and I remember buying a ton of them because of the pictures, really, for the most part. But they were very lowbrow, like bottom feeder sort of magazines that mostly all black and white pages, and like I said, a few color photographs spread throughout. Nothing of substance. Like, I don't remember there being any record reviews or anything interesting in any of these magazines. So the market was flooded with a lot of that stuff. And if you were following a particular band, you bought all of them because they were cheap and they had some cool photos in there that you never saw before. So, and then you had like in the 70s, I started buying 16 magazine probably around 78-ish, I guess. Maybe even earlier than that, but I was only 7-8 years old, so I was a Kiss, freak by 77, 78. So if they were ever on the cover or there was any kind of story on Kiss in 16, I bought it. I probably had I don't know, at least 10 or 15, 16 magazines that all had Kiss cover stories from 77, 78 to about 80. And the thing about 16 was they continued to cover Kiss well into like 81 with The Elder. You know, you would see Paul Stanley with the purple headband on the cover of 16 magazine in 1981, which was rare because everybody else really abandoned Kiss by that point. There was a Circus cover. I think I'll put it on the screen if I find it. There was a Circus cover in 1980 that had Eric Carr in the makeup on from like an unmasked photo session. And that was pretty much it. Like, you didn't see or hear Kiss, see or read anything about Kiss in Circus during Unmasked or The Elder. Maybe during Creatures they started dabbling and doing some articles on them again. But by 83, look it up, Circus kind of was back on board on the Kiss train again. Yeah, going back to 16, I used to buy it. They started doing articles on Van Halen and Cheap Trick like in 70, 79, 80. And the thing about 16 was always embarrassing to buy it as a kid because, you know, the whole magazine was like Leif Garrett and Sean Cassidy and the Dukes of Hazzard guys, whoever was the hunk of the moment, Scott Baio, you know, all these guys that were on TV and in movies. And there would be like a little Kiss picture on the cover, you know, and like 9, 10 years old. And it's just super embarrassing that you're going up there buying this magazine with all these teeny boppers on the cover. And I just remember that was just something I remember from the time. I bought it anyway. I didn't care. I was like, all right, it's got Kiss in it. Big 3-page Kiss centerfold. I'm buying it. 16 eventually started putting out a rock-oriented magazine called Rockline. I don't think it lasted that long, a year or two maybe, maybe a little bit longer than that. But they would have like Journey and Styx and Foreigner and Kiss and Van Halen and like Loverboy and that sort of stuff from like 80, 81, 82, 83. So they might have been around for maybe 3 years. I'm not really sure how long they lasted. I would have to Google it and see. But I owned a handful of those issues too. I would buy them. But it wasn't high on the agenda list because, you know, my money at that time as a kid needed to go towards the prime stuff, which was like Creem and Circus and, you know, at the time Hit Parader and things like that. So yeah, as we discuss these magazines, I'm kind of starting from like what was the bottom of the barrel and like kind of work my way up a little bit. I'm going to rank them at the end of the video. I'm going to rank my personal order of what were the best magazines from best to worst during this whole time frame of the 70s and 80s. But for the sake of just discussing them, I'm just going to kind of randomly jump around here. And towards the end, I'll get towards, you know, my favorites, but I'm going to spend more time on those. But for now, we're just going to continue to talk about the stuff that was kind of like, not all of it was bottom feeder, but a lot of it was just kind of capitalizing on what was popular at the time. There wasn't a lot of substance to most of these magazines. Like I said, 16, Rockline. There was one called Hard Rock Video, which was probably started coming out like in 84-ish, 85. And it was basically articles based on MTV videos. So they would have, you know, like Wasp on the cover or Rat or whoever, Billy Squier. And there would be a bunch of photos in the magazine from like whatever the current video was of that album. And they would talk about the making of the video. The whole magazine wasn't about that, but it was kind of based on that. And then they would sprinkle in some other stuff. I don't have a copy of it in front of me. I probably own 1 or 2 copies. They might be buried in storage in one of my boxes somewhere. So I'm just kind of going on memory, and I'll put some covers on the screen here so you can see. Some of you probably remember this magazine and remember buying it. Again, just kind of like a fluff magazine, not anything real of substance in there. But when you're like a teenager, you know, you're starved for information. Again, this was pre-internet, pre-YouTube. And you really didn't see much of anything from any of your favorite bands anywhere except in magazines. Very rarely did you see them on TV, except when MTV, you know, started coming around in 81. You were starved, again, like for content. And magazines were a really big deal back in the 70s and 80s for content and previously to that. So you would buy them, you know, like whether they were good or rags or whatever, you would just buy it because it was something to read and it was cool to see pictures the latest pictures of whatever your favorite artist was. And then once you start getting into the 80s, and I'm going to concentrate, like I said later, on the 70s rock magazines towards the end. The Circuses, the Creams, the Hit Paraders, Rock Scene was another one we'll get into, which was around in the 70s and in the 80s. But next, we're going to talk about some 80s hairband era magazines, which, there was a few of them. There wasn't a ton of them, but they started gradually kind of copycatting each other. But the main ones were like, you had Faces, you had Rip magazine, which was Lon Friend, I think was the editor of that. And the biggest one was Metal Edge, the late Jerry Miller. She passed away, I'm not sure how many years ago, but Metal Edge really was like the pioneer of the magazine that was geared towards the whole Headbangers Ball, MTV, hairband scene. There was Circus at the time, which, Circus was going to do articles on whoever was selling records because they wanted to sell magazines. In 84 and 85 and 86, on Circus, you would see, on the cover, you would see, Motley Crue and Rad and Bon Jovi and Dokken, Ozzy, that sort of stuff. By 85, I think Metal Edge debuted sometime in 85, I believe, 85 or 86. It was a good magazine from the start, but it actually got better as it got along because they started incorporating a lot more color into the pages, glossy color pages. Again, most of these magazines back then were printed on dull black and white paper. So it'd be a mixture of that with black and white photos and then color photos. But Metal Edge really catered to like the MTV Headbangers Ball crowd. I mean, you would see full-blown 3-4 page articles on bands like, Saigon Kick, Bang Tango, the Sleazebees. Well, maybe not a 3-page article on the Sleazebees, but you would see, a 1-page article on somebody like that. They really paid attention to like these bands that were just putting out albums and were not really selling a ton of records, but they were getting played on MTV. And so you would see articles on these up and coming bands with full blown interviews. And it was really a place for these young hair bands to get a lot of exposure to like a huge audience. I'm sure it helped a lot of them. You had like the Britney Foxes and the Cinderellas that were not really getting much attention yet from the big players, the Circuses and the Hit Paraders and Creem. Gradually they started to, well, I should say the big bands did, like I said earlier, the Dokkens, the Motley Crue, the Rats, the Wasps, all that. We're in Circus, we're in Hit Parader, we're in Creem would put out these metal special magazines every 3 months. I think it was quarterly. It was like a spotlight on heavy metal or whatever, hair bands. So they were getting covers, but Metal Edge was very much into giving a lot of press to the young bands, the bands like Enough's Enough, or I don't know. I mean, I'm drawing a blank now. There were so many of them. Like Tora. The list is a million miles long of bands that. And when they first came out, Tesla, stuff like that. And for people like, me who were into that stuff at the time, I was buying it every month, and it was cool to read articles on bands that you just weren't going to see anywhere else. That's not to say I liked all the bands, I would like a song here and there, but I was mainly buying it because they would always do giant spreads on Kiss. And so for me, it was really just about that. It was something to read. If you weren't around back then, before the internet and before YouTube, there really wasn't anything else. It was like MTV and magazines, and you would go to tons of concerts. Like during the hairband era, you were able to go to a pretty cool concert like it seemed like a few times a month. There was Twisted Sister, then it was Dokken, then it was Rat, then it was Bon Jovi, then it was Cinderella, then it was Triumph, then it was Wasp. Then it was Guns N' Roses, and then Aerosmith, and then Kiss, and just it was a bombardment of bands. And then it started being like the metal bands, like Metallica, or Priest was always coming. Priest was around like every other year. Priest was touring, and you can see him in 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, I'm not sure about, 86 with Turbo. Like, there was this stretch where these bands, you could see them almost every year on a tour. And now it's like, bands tour a lot now, but back then it was a new album and a tour, new album and a tour, new album and a tour constantly. So there was always concerts to go to. It was like a lot of fun to be a teenager during that time. And so, buying the magazines was just kind of just went along with that. You bought the magazine, you bought the tour program, you bought the t-shirt, and you wore the shirt to school the next day. It was all about showing your identity. That was it's a teenager thing. You don't give a shit now when you're an adult, but well, some guys do. But for me, it was always just about representing. You wanted to be cool, and you wanted to show that you were into stuff that maybe other people weren't into, just to be different or whatever. And then it became mainstream, and then you weren't different anymore. You were just like everybody else. You'd go to school with a Motley Crue t-shirt on. Before you knew it, there was 10 other people with Motley Crue t-shirts on. I liked it when it was a little earlier on. You were kind of, you felt like, it was like that Rolling Stone magazine mentality. You felt like you were part of this little exclusive club of people that only knew about Motley Crue, Too Fast for Love, and like Shout at the Devil, and all of a sudden Home Sweet Home comes out, and Smoking in the Boys Room, and now everybody loves Motley Crue. And then by Girls, 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 forget it, and Dr. Feelgood, it was all over. But when you were into a band early on, you kind of felt like you owned them. You had this little exclusive club with, not that many people that really knew about the band, and it just made it a little cooler. Again, that's like a teenage mentality. Unfortunately, Rolling Stone magazine carries that mentality as like 70-year-old men. That's part of the problem. It's funny to joke about and laugh about now and look back on, but I don't act like that now. It's like I could give two shits. If I know about a band and they get huge and they sell a lot of records, I'm happy for them. As long as they don't change, that's the problem back then too, was when you loved a band and they were like underground and they would hit big, and all of a sudden after they hit big, their albums started to suck or partially suck, where they were bringing the big name producer and then they got a little more diluted, and then they brought in the outside writers and trying to chase more hits. Record company wants another record, but with more like commercial aspects to it. So now all of a sudden your cool little underground band is now mainstream, and then the music is changing as a result. And then you start backing away from them a little bit. That happened with me with a lot of hair bands too. Motley Crue was one of them. I'm trying to think of who else. That Rat eventually, the first the Rat EP and like Invasion of Your Privacy and Out of the Cellar. The Out of the Cellar was the first one, and then Invasion of Your Privacy. And even Dancing Undercover had good stuff on it. By after Dancing Undercover, I started losing interest because it started kind of getting diluted after a while. A few good songs on each record, but those first three full studio records and the EP's killer, just had an element to them that was still kind of pure. And then it just chasing the hit, chasing the MTV video, whatever, it starts to kind of like, get a little thin after a while. Anyway, getting off topic, which I tend to do a lot. That's why my videos end up being 3 fucking hours long. Oh, well, let me go off on this tangent and then this tangent. And oh yeah, what about that? Sorry. So we were talking about the hairband era rock magazines, and Metal Edge was kind of like the premier one. And then you had Rip, which was also, a fairly decent rock magazine. It was all on glossy paper, from what I remember. A lot of good photos. They would do a lot of good articles, and then he would do articles on some of the heavier bands. You would see articles on like Slayer, Metallica, Megadeth, Testament, that sort of stuff. Rip would cover that. Suicidal Tendencies. Like whatever was trending on Headbangers Ball is kind of where that magazine went. And as the music trends got a little heavier, he kind of went along with it, the Alice in Chains and all that stuff. And Metal Edge really didn't do that too much, you know what I mean? You might see an article on a grunge band here and there in Metal Edge by like 91, 92, but they were still waving the flag. Like in 1992, they were still doing articles on like whatever hair bands were still struggling and hanging around, like, the Slaughters of the world and stuff like that. So, and then you had Faces, which was kind of like not as good as Metal Edge and not as good as Rip. It's kind of like almost like a very fluff-oriented, not great photos. Just, it was, I don't want to say it was a bottom feeder magazine, but it was definitely like a let's cash in on whatever's going on right now, whatever the publisher was, probably just, we need to have a rock magazine on the market, and they threw Faces together. And, it was just okay. It wasn't great. Now, if you're talking about rock scene, we'll get to rock scene in the 70s later when I talk about the 70s magazines. But rock scene in the 80s morphed into a fairly decent rock magazine for the hairband crowd. They, again, would cover all the same bands that were in, Hit Parader and Circus, Creem at the time, which was the big hitters again, the Motley Crues and the Rats and the Dawkins and Twisted Sister and all that, Metallica, whatever. Kiss, a lot, Kiss was in rock scene a lot. In fact, rock scene eventually started putting out their own Kiss special magazines where they were published by rock scene, the same publishers. And they were really good. There was a lot of cool photos in them. As a Kiss fan in the 80s, it was like a throwback to the 70s era of being a Kiss fan, when there was constantly Kiss special edition magazines. Tiger Beat would put one out. Teen Beat would put one out. Creem put out a killer all Kiss issue. There was just we'll get into. I'm going to talk about Grooves in a few minutes, which put out 3 amazing Kiss magazines in like 78 and 79. But yeah, rock scene was actually pretty quality. They would do the same thing, kind of like what Metal Edge would do. They would do articles on the B-level sort of bands, the bands that were, playing like small theaters and didn't really have a gigantic hit, but they were still on MTV. You would see a 3-page article on, I don't know, Bang Tango or like Vane. Vane was another one of my favorite hair bands that like didn't really go anywhere, but kind of an underground favorite amongst a lot of people, and real, heavier than you thought they were when you look at them. Great band. So rock scene wasn't too bad. And then really for me, as far as 80s rock magazines go, and we're talking, if you want to go back to like, I think their first issue might have been in 82, Kerrang! From England. Kerrang! Magazine was like the premier hard rock magazine if you were into like the heavier side of hard rock. I'm talking early 80s. They were doing articles on like Thin Lizzy and like Deep Purple and like UFO, Motorhead, a lot of Kiss coverage, a lot of they would do some Van Halen stuff here and there, a lot of AC/DC coverage, Saxon, Priest, Maiden, like the whole classic British wave of heavy metal stuff. Def Leppard early on. Kerrang! Was like the shit. I mean, great album reviews. They kind of were like the British equivalent of what Creem was in the 70s. They had a great staff of writers, guys like Malcolm Dome and Jeff Barton, and I'm drawing a blank. I'll see if I can remember some of the other guys' names. I'll put them on the bottom. But they had Howard Johnson, I think, was one guy. I think he was the big Angel guy. He loved Angel. Great staff of writers on Kerrang! Dante Bonuto, I think is how you pronounce his last name. Another guy. I think he was the AC/DC guy there. And might have been the Kiss guy there too. Record reviews were always great. The articles were always great. There was like an element of humor and sarcasm in the magazine, which was very much to me like a British version of Creem. They were like the successor to Creem. Like when Creem was starting to trail off by the mid 80s, Kerrang! Was kind of like picking up the torch for like that style of writing. You could see live reviews of shows. It was always cool to look through the ads in the back of Kerrang! Magazine because they would have import record stores where you could order stuff that was put out on CD in Europe that you couldn't get in the United States. Like I remember like when the Angel albums came out, you had to order them from Japan at first and pay like a fucking arm and a leg for them because the U.S. record companies were not going to put any of that stuff out. So just like a lot of it was when you were going to get Kerrang! Magazine, it wasn't just typically found on your corner newsstand. I mean, most of the time you had to go to a specialty record shop. Tower Records started carrying it eventually, but I would always get it at a place called Listening Booth in the Deptford Mall in here in Jersey. And you would get it at places in New York City like Revolver Records or It's Only Rock and Roll, Vintage Vinyl up in North Jersey. These like cool underground record stores that were big on like the heavy metal and like carrying bootlegs. It was another Another reason to go to New York City all the time was Revolver, especially if I remember right. Tons of bootleg CDs. I mean, they would start out with vinyl, but me and a couple of my friends, we would drive up there a few times a year with a wad of cash in our pockets, and just for the sole purpose of going bootleg hunting. So you would see, they would have like a Who concert from like 1969, soundboard, whatever, just released from, the Fillmore East or whatever. The CD would be like $25, and it was just so exciting because there was no YouTube, so there was no streaming, there was nothing. So if you wanted live concerts, you were going to record expos or these record stores that were ballsy enough to carry the bootlegs and risk getting in trouble for it. And it was like Christmas, I would go to these record expos with stacks of VHS concerts, pro shots from Europe, stuff that was just filmed last week, or CDs. Started out on, with, getting bootleg cassettes, and it eventually went over to CDs and then DVDs. But the bootleg CD market was booming in the 80s. I mean, into the early 90s, until you could start burning CDs. And then it was still kind of booming because people were still making their own CDs and on CDRs and, trading and stuff like that. But once everybody could make copies of everything, it really started to kind of go downhill. And then once you could upload it online and get it for free, it was really, there's still a little small market for it, I think, but it killed everything, just like it killed the record stores and whatever. Going back to Kerrang magazine, you had to really seek it out and find it. Sometimes it was hard to find because I would go into my local record store, they would get like 3 of them in. And if there was any other dudes in your neighborhood that were like hip to Kerrang, you were fucked, because if you didn't get there on the day that it came out, it was gone. And I remember there were a couple of record stores that I knew people that worked at, and I would get them to hold it for me if they remembered to do it. I would stop in. If they held it for me, I would buy it. But again, Kerrang, awesome. Just a legendary hard rock, heavy metal magazine from the 80s. I think that kind of wraps up like the 80s hair band, hard rock, sort of rock magazine as far as the best stuff for me personally. I mean, you'll see my rankings where I rank all these at. Now, when you get into the 70s, for me, it was always about Creem, Circus, Hit Parader. Once in a while, I would buy Trouser Press. Not a lot of magazine stores in my area carried that. I would find it occasionally. If they had Cheap Trick, I bought a lot of them that had Cheap Trick on the cover, which they were on the cover like a few times, like maybe 3 or 4 times. They would do articles on like a lot of punk and new wave stuff. You would see Elvis Costello, Squeeze, The Jam, The Pretenders, The Knack, The Cars, Devo, that sort of stuff. Now, earlier in the 70s, it was more like, you would see classic rock stuff. You would see like Todd Rundgren on the cover, Neil Young, The Who, Paul McCartney and Wings, a lot of Beatles-centric stuff. Their publisher, Ira Robbins, I think was their publisher, their editor. Ira Robbins was a big Anglophile, was really into like British stuff. So there was always a lot of Who and Beatles-oriented stuff, and he was a big Cheap Trick guy. So he showed a lot of love to Cheap Trick in like 78, 79, 80. And Trouser Press was just a great magazine. I mean, there was great, excellent album reviews, in-depth, not fluff album reviews, not like, a paragraph just going over. They would go in-depth about the type of, songs and the writing, and really give you a pretty good idea of what was good and what was bad about a particular record. The articles were always well written. It was just a cool magazine. It was like the alternative to Creem. It was like the serious Creem, or I don't know how else I could really put it. They would cover a lot of the same artists, cutting edge artists, punk, new wave, and some classic rock stuff. Never really any heavy metal. There was hardly ever any like Kiss. I don't know if there was never like there was never Van Halen or AC/DC like in Trouser Press. It was very much like a punk new wave centric sort of vibe going on. A lot of the Ramones, Blondie. Creem really covered a lot of those artists as well. But Creem attacked it from a different angle. Creem was more about humor and sarcasm, Whereas Trouser Press had a little bit of that, but it was more of like a serious rock magazine. And so any back issues you could pick up at Trouser Press, it's definitely well worth the effort to find them, especially if you like all of those artists. I still like digging through my back issues and reading them. I probably have about, I don't know, 25 or 30 copies of Trouser Press hanging around somewhere. Another one which I really enjoyed, and it lasted into the 80s. I don't know how far, but it did. A magazine called Record Review. Not really widely known, but excellent. I mean, again, serious journalists, serious record reviewers, really good in-depth articles. It was mostly, classic rock artists being covered in Record Review. At the time, they weren't classic rock. They're looked at as classic rock now. But you would see Van Halen, you would see REO Speedwagon, you would see Styx, Alice Cooper, and then you would see McCartney and Wings and Todd Rundgren, Hendrix, Beatles. I don't know, just anything that would a lot of Tom Petty, that sort of stuff. Whatever was happening from 77 until about 82. They started getting into more Loverboy and Foreigner and that sort of stuff by 81, 82, which was all good stuff. But the articles were always very well written. The interviews were in depth. A good line of questioning, not just fluff bullshit. I keep saying fluff, but I don't know any other word to really describe what I'm talking about. And the record reviews, again, the magazine's called Record Review. They were very much a big emphasis on album reviews, and they were always really good, well-written, in-depth reviews of albums. And so it's kind of like a serious rock magazine, if you really want to get into the nuts and bolts of how albums were made or how songs were written, that sort of thing. It's not it wasn't like a sensationalist kind of magazine. Really not a lot of pictures. The whole inside of the magazine was black and white. It wasn't about appealing to me as an 11-year-old in 1981. It was appealing to more the serious music listener, which is fine. And I enjoyed that too. Even as a kid, I just soaked it all up. I wanted to know about why did the producer do this? And, why were these songs left off the record? And how did you write this? And that sort of stuff appealed to me even as a kid. I didn't want to just know what your fucking favorite color was or, favorite food. So Record Review kind of scratched that itch, and again, if you can find any used copies of it online anywhere, a lot of them will go for $15-20 a pop now. Another one that was around that I really didn't get into too much was Musician magazine. That catered more towards the mainstream pop rock sort of side of things. They would do articles on Steely Dan and Michael Jackson and Sting. I don't know, Edie Brickell. It was more adult music, which I don't mean that as an insult. Either the teenagers like me who weren't really into that kind of music that much at the time, I can appreciate it now. But it was a little bit more of a mature magazine, again, geared towards musicians. So there was a lot of interviews with record producers and people in the industry, behind the scenes kind of stuff, and the artists. And it served the purpose for people that really were interested in that side of things. I never really bought it all that much. Occasionally I would pick it up if there was an article in there on somebody that I cared about. I ended up reading a lot of those in waiting rooms, doctor's offices, or wherever I was hanging out at, recording studios or rehearsal studios. They would have magazines lying around, and you would have inevitably see Musician magazine laying around. I put Musician in the same category as guitar player or modern drummer and that sort of thing, where it's just geared more towards the musician and the person that is interested in all the nerdy shit about music and not necessarily the surface stuff, which is all good too. But I don't really consider that part of the rock magazine heyday. That was just a different thing, geared towards a different demographic than the teenager who was just looking for cool pictures and record reviews and stuff like that. But anyway, still a good magazine. I just wanted to mention it as a side note. Now we're getting into what I would consider. Oh, I forgot to mention about 70s magazines, and they were kind of like a bottom feeder, but they were really good at it. Really high quality. It was Grooves magazine. Started coming out, I think, in 78-ish, and they would do articles on like Fleetwood Mac and then like the Babies and stuff like that. And then you would see like in the same magazine the Bee Gees and then the Cars, and it was like a very eclectic mix of like, you know, Bob Seger. And then they would put out special edition magazines, and they put out these 3 special edition Kiss magazines right in a row, 78 into 79. All of them were just, I mean, they nailed it. I mean, the pictures were pictures you never saw anywhere else. You know, whatever photographers they licensed photos from were not the typical guys that were always seen in Circus and, you know, Hit Parade or whatever. The pages were all glossy. A lot of the pages were color. It was just killer. I mean, these Kiss magazines and some other special edition Kiss magazines in the 70s were really good too. I'll put some pictures of some of the ones on the screen. There's one called The Best of Kiss that was awesome. Again, color, glossy pictures you never saw anywhere else. There was a lot of bottom feeder Kiss special edition magazines, cheap stuff. And then there was a lot of like Teen Beat, you know, Teen Star, printed on cheap paper. Sometimes the photos were good, sometimes they weren't, but it was just nonstop. Every month I would go, or every couple of weeks I would go to the newsstand, and there was another one, and then another one, and another. I was just buying them all. I could buy as many as I could get my hands on. I still own most of them to this day. But besides the Creem special edition Kiss issue, the Best of Kiss and the 3 Grooves were like gold standard Kiss magazines for the time. Just based on the photos, you know, it was just, I just remember being blown the fuck away by the pictures in these magazines. The cover was cool. The back covers were cool. Shots from like Alive and Hotter Than Hell. And if you're a Kiss fan, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Definitely a must have, especially at the time. So now we're going to move up into what I consider were the top 3 or 4 hitters of the 70s. Now, I forgot to mention Rock Scene in the 70s. I mentioned Rock Scene in the 80s. Rock Scene in the 70s was a cool magazine. It was very much an underground, New York area sort of thing. I think it was published out of New York. They really covered a lot of the whole CBGB's New York, avant-garde, Fillmore East scene. A lot of early glam. So you saw a lot of Bowie, T-Rex, Alice Cooper, Slade, New York Dolls, Lou Reed, and Kiss. They were very early on the Kiss bandwagon. You would see pictures of Kiss gigs from like 74, from like the Beacon Theater in 75. The New Year's Eve show they did with Iggy and the Stooges and Blue Oyster Cult, you would see pictures of that in Rock Scene, like in early 74. They were on the Kiss train very early, and they would do a lot of covers with Kiss. And then they started getting into like the punk scene. You know, they would do a lot of Ramones and like the Dead Boys and Sex Pistols and whatever. And like everybody else, started morphing into like whatever was happening at the time. They would start doing a lot of Zeppelin and Queen and Aerosmith, Ted Nugent, that sort of stuff. But they were always a strong presence as far as Kiss fans. You would always find something cool in a Rock Scene magazine in the 70s as far as Kiss was concerned. And they got a little bit into like the new wave and the Cheap Trick stuff and the Cars and Blondie and things like that. But again, they weren't like top shelf. It was really good, but it wasn't. They were not like part of the mainstream the way like Circus, Hit Parader, and Creem were. Now we're getting into the top 3 big hitters of the time, and I would say out of Creem, Circus, and Hit Parader absolutely was the worst of the 3. Just again, the word fluff comes to mind. Very. Like, I had heard rumors that most of their interviews and their articles were basically written around the press releases of a new album. So they would get a press release from the record company, and all this information was in the press release, and they would take quotes out of the press release and put them in their articles. They were like, there was a lot of quote unquote phony interviews. I don't know how true that is, but I could tell you that most of the interviews in these Hit Parader magazines were not anything groundbreaking or earth shattering. Very, very surface interviews, very short interviews, a 1.5, 2-page article filled with a lot of nonsense and some quotes here and there. Yeah, like a lot of space filler going on. I mean, the back half of the fucking magazine was song lyrics. So that tells you right there that they were very thin on content, at least from my perspective. Record reviews were very short, 1 paragraph long, not very informative, either very dismissive or very gushing, depending on who the writer was for whether they liked the band or not. Not a lot of detail. There would literally be like 2 or 3 pages of record reviews, and you would see like 20 record reviews on 2 pages. That's how short they were a lot of times. Paragraph and a half. The good thing about Hit Parader was, again, it was just another outlet to see some new pictures from like the latest tour of whatever your favorite band was. The downside to Hit Parader was the quality of the printing of the photos. I don't know what printer they used in the 70s into the early 80s. It started to eventually get better by the early 80s, but in the 70s, depending on, there could be 4 copies of the November 75 issue of Hit Parader sitting on the newsstand. You could pick up all 4 of them. 2 of them would have perfect printing. The other 2, all the colors, like when you go to a printer and they print a color picture, it's like magenta, yellow, blue. I forget what the color separation. There's like 3 or 4 color separations, and they print them all separately through the printing press to make a color photo. So it goes through once with the yellow, and then you run it through again with the blue. And when you layer them all on top of each other, you have a color photo. Well, the color separations were like half the time never lined up right. So you would look at this picture of like Robert Plant, and you would look at his face, and there would be all these outlines of like yellow or blue, or he would like be like in triple. You would see like his face looked like it was like doubled. It was blurry, out of focus, and the colors weren't lined up. So it was just a shitty looking photo because of that. And it was printed on matte paper. So Hit Parader really didn't get into glossy paper as far as their magazines go until probably early 80s, maybe 83-ish, I want to say. You would start seeing glossy paper. Even on the black and white pages, it would be glossy paper. The rest of the time, the magazine cover was glossy. Everything on the inside was on matte paper, flat, like newsprint paper. So the color photos look like shit. Dark, blurry, out of focus. Again, the color separation's not always lined up. You had to leaf through a couple copies of it in the newsstand to find one that wasn't like that. I don't know why they didn't fire their fucking printer after years of that. I mean, why can't you get it together? It's a major magazine, and they're putting this out on the newsstand, and it's garbage. Really was really bad. I think they had some cool cover photos. I think they had a good selection of artists that they covered. There was always a good mixture of like, the Zeppelins and the Aerosmiths and the Kisses mixed in with like, I don't know, the Babies or Angel, or, maybe an article here and there on like the Sweet or something like that. They didn't go too deep on the obscure artists or the British artists or whatever that were like more obscure. They didn't really get it much into the punk new wave. There was a period of time where you would see like Blondie and the Cars and like the really big heavy hitters as far as the new wave scene, but you would never really see like Devo or Gary Newman or anything like that. I don't think there was hardly anything on the Sex Pistols or like the Jam, maybe the Ramones, a couple of blurbs here and there. So Hit Parader was really all about the mainstream hard rock and classic rock for the most part. So out of the 3 heavy hitters, Hit Parader to me is at the bottom of those 3 biggest 70s rock magazines, in my opinion anyway. So next on the list of the prominent 70s into the 80s rock magazines would be Circus magazine, which started out as Circus Raves. And I forgot to mention, Hit Parader had been around since like the 50s. I saw some covers from like 1955. I mean, I'll maybe put a couple of them on the screen here. Yeah, Hit Parader's been around a long time. I don't know when circus raves started. I'd have to look that up. It may have started in the very early 70s. I don't know if they were around for the Beatles, like late 60s. I don't know if they were publishing anything back then. Circus magazine started out as Circus Raves in the early 70s, and eventually just evolved into being called Circus. And back in the day, Circus was always printed on glossy paper, which gave them an instant advantage over everybody else because the photos were always just great live photos from the most recent tours. You could always, like, I mean, some of the Kiss photos, like in the early, like the 74, 75 issues of Circus, them, I guess it was like the Beacon Theater, whatever. Yeah, it's color glossy photos, of, Paul standing there with the flames going up right behind them, or Gene spitting blood or whatever. It just clear, cool photos, and you would never see these photos anywhere. They did not use stock photos. They did not use press release photos. They did not use common photos from photo sessions that everybody, the Barry Levine sessions, like that poster right there behind me with the Mylar background to it. You'd see pictures from that photo session all over the place, in 16 and wherever. Circus did not do that. Every once in a while they would. I mean, I think that photo session, Circus, they did a centerfold of Peter Criss and Gene, I think, from that year. But you didn't see that, glossy centerfold of that photo session. You weren't going to get that in Hit Parader. You weren't going to get that in a lot of other places. I mean, I think Circus really was ahead of the game as far as the quality of photos used and the print quality. Again, Hit Parader sucked. It looked terrible. So Circus, again, was another one of those magazines that early on really got behind Kiss. So you had Kiss cover stories, I think starting in late 75, maybe, or early 76. I'm not sure what the first Kiss cover was. Regardless, by Destroyer, you were seeing Kiss on the cover of Circus magazine. And then you started, and Creem too. We'll get into Creem in a few minutes. But Hit Parader, same deal, but Circus really hammered away. And let's not kid ourselves. It's because Kiss was huge. They wanted to sell magazines. But they were, friendly to Kiss. They were not antagonistic. The reviews of them were always, pretty positive. They weren't putting them in the magazine to make fun of them or anything like that. They did a lot for Kiss in the 70s, and then Circus early on was really good at having articles on bands that you wouldn't see too much of in a lot of other magazines, like Mott the Hoople or Slade, or at the time, you got to remember, in the early to mid 70s, everybody that was popular, it was all the same bands that were popular. It was like Led Zeppelin, it was Queen, it was Bad Company. They didn't really go into stuff like the Eagles or anything more on the mellow side. You would see Jackson Browne or something like that once in a while in Circus. Very rarely did you see the Eagles in Circus magazine. You would see Linda Ronstadt or something like that by the mid to late 70s. But they didn't touch a lot on that soft rock stuff. Occasionally, here and there would be something. It was just a lot of Zeppelin, Kiss, Rolling Stones, Rod Stewart, Queen, and did I say Aerosmith? And then later on stuff like Ted Nugent, Cheap Trick by 78, 79, 80. A lot of cover stories on Cheap Trick in Creem, or not Creem, Circus. They dabbled a little bit in the new wave, Blondie, Cars. Then they started getting into the Pat Benatar, Loverboy, Foreigner, Styx. They would do some. There was a cover story on Rush, I think, in Circus a few times, which was really cool. Creem magazine would do a little bit on Rush here and there. Hit Parader sometimes. I think Circus probably gave Rush the most coverage in the late 70s into the early 80s. One thing about Circus magazine that was interesting was that there was a period of time in the late 70s where they attempted to go bi-weekly. So the magazine was coming out every 2 weeks, which is crazy. You know, it was almost like a local newspaper. Well, newspapers were daily, but there were some like the Village Voice and like the Aquarian and EC Rocker and stuff that were weekly newspapers. But Circus attempted to go bi-weekly, and it must not have been working out for them because they went back to being just a monthly, not a very long period of time. It's probably a very big undertaking to print that magazine every 2 weeks between the costs and the staff and having to get all the writing done and whatever's involved in putting that magazine out. But that was a very interesting period of time where they were just pumping out the magazines. And I think that was the period of time where they were doing a lot of non-music articles too. They started doing a lot of pop culture, lifestyle articles, and things on like actors and television stars and things like that. Probably because they just needed the content at that point when you're putting a magazine out every 2 weeks, you know. But the articles in Circus were a step above Hit Parader. Not quite as entertaining as Creem, but Circus was a little more on the, you know, Circus was more serious than Creem, and Circus was better writing than Hit Parader. So they were kind of like in the middle of the two. And the album reviews were at least reasonable length and reasonably detailed. They would have a lot of little blurb stories. The first couple of pages would be like a little tiny article on what was the latest thing that Brian May of Queen was doing or whatever, just different random kind of stuff. More like a news page. But the main thrust of the magazine was just 2-3 page articles on everybody. A lot of Van Halen in 78, 79, 80, 81. AC/DC, they jumped on the heavy metal bandwagon pretty quick. You know, you would see cover stories on AC/DC and Judas Priest and Van Halen, Iron Maiden by like Maiden not until probably like 83, 82, 83, right around Number of the Beast, I guess. But Priest, they were an early supporter of. And then they got into obviously the hairband stuff, the Def Leppard and the Motley Crue, heavy on the Rat, the Dokken, Twisted Sister, Ozzy. But in the 70s, it was all Sabbath and Rainbow. So they kind of just did whatever was sort of happening at the time, but they did it pretty well. And the quality of the print of the magazine was always really high standard. And they had a great classified section. I talked about this in my one Kiss studio albums video, I think, where I was buying bootlegs out of the back of Circus from these guys that were advertising back there very early on, by 83, 84. There was a guy named Ken Kozira, Kozyra, I think is how you spelled it. He was up in New Hampshire. And this guy advertised live concerts on cassette. Cheap Trick, Kiss, AC/DC, Van Halen, Judas Priest, whatever. Send $1 for the catalog. I sent $1 for the catalog, and I got back in this manila, 11 by 12 or 10 by 12 envelope or whatever size they were, 11 by 12. It was about a 1/4 inch thick. It must have been about 50 pages or 25 pages or whatever. Tiny, tiny print. You needed a microscope, a magnifying glass to read. He had so many fucking concerts on cassette. I mean, radio broadcasts, soundboard recordings, stuff from Europe. I mean, every tour you can imagine. I shit myself when I got this. I was like, I can't work enough hours to make enough money to buy all the shit that I want. I was 14. So, and I worked at 7-Eleven after school every day for a few hours each day from the time I was 11 till I was about 13 or 14. Just sweeping the floor. And I was actually used to run the cash register, believe it or not, at 12. It's just a totally different world back then. He'd get arrested today if he had a kid running the cash register. I used to make Slurpees. There would be freaking porno mags behind the counter, Hustler and Playboy, whatever. I don't remember whether I ever rang anybody up for a Hustler magazine. I don't think any guy with any self-respect is not going to ask an 11-year-old kid to give him the latest issue of Hustler magazine. That takes a lot of balls. But I remember thinking to myself, oh my God, I'm behind the counter. The guy that ran the store. He was a franchisee owner, a guy named Steve. He would be busy doing like manager stuff, administrative stuff. He just put in this closed circuit camera system in the store. So he would go in the back, and if he suspected anybody was stealing, like any of his night employees or whatever, he was in the back looking at videos for like a half hour. He'd say, "Hey, look, I'm going to be in the back. Can you handle it out here for a little while? If you need anything, just holler." And I'd be out there. I mean, I'm 11, and I'm running the cash register, ringing people up for freaking cigarettes and freaking Slurpees, rolling papers, Easy Widers, Job 1.5s, or whatever they were called. I mean, like, this is 1981. It was, again, you would never see that now. I mean, you would never see that in the last 30 years, probably, let alone now. I mean, the dude would be arrested just for the fact that I was within 10 feet of a porno mag. But I don't know. I guess I got to tell you, I'm 56. I just feel like I grew up in the tail end of like the best time to be a kid and a teenager. And I know it was probably fun to be a kid like in the 50s and 60s and experience all that, was Beatlemania and all that stuff I wish I'd experienced. There's a lot of negative stuff back then too with, war, Vietnam and all that stuff. But as far as being a teenager in the late 70s into the like mid 80s, it was like you didn't have to wear a helmet riding a bike. People were like just, and I know there's a double-edged sword because like we did a lot of reckless stuff that probably I don't remember like hearing about a lot of kids like this wave of like people dying in like drunk driving accidents or like in car accidents. I feel like everybody lived recklessly back then, but we were also a lot more mature and more careful about the things that we did. And I don't know, I feel it's a double-edged thing again because obviously you don't want to condone drunk driving, but everybody I know growing up in that era, for me, everybody fucking drove drunk home from a gig or a party or a concert or their friend's house. And I just don't remember there being like this huge, massive amount of drunk driving accidents. Now, I probably by the 80s that started to change with MAD and all that stuff, and there's a lot more attention brought to it. People probably started being a lot more reckless. I'm generalizing here. I don't know any of this for a fact. It's just the general feeling that I have from being a teenager back then. I feel like we had a lot more freedom to be stupid, and most of the time we handled it pretty well. Like we there wasn't a lot of tragedies going on. Like today, you're overprotected. You kids, they need a helmet to eat a fucking Hot Pocket. You got to put a helmet on. And parents are very much helicopter parents, and it's a different world now. Kids are bombarded with a lot of. We were lucky as kids. We weren't bombarded with all of the negativity, the 24-hour news bullshit. Kids today have pumped into their heads that the world is coming to an end and they're all going to die like every day, constantly, for whether it's politics or whether it's the weather or whether it's you name it. You're going to die. You're going to die tomorrow. No wonder kids are depressed and freaking suicidal and like whatever mental issues kids have today. A lot of it is brought on by us dumbass adults, you know what I mean? But I don't want to get into that, but I feel like we avoided a lot of that. We didn't have the phones, we didn't have social media. Kids are dealing with a lot of shit today that we didn't have to deal with. So again, that could be another reason for the stress, the bullying online and the social media nonsense. I know as a kid, if I had access on a phone 24/7 to everything a kid has access to now, I'd probably be fucked up in the head, or I would be making a lot of bad decisions or choices or whatever. But when you were a kid in 1981, you didn't have any of that. You had cable TV was like a big deal. So you had like maybe 50 channels of television, and most of it was, very sanitized. There wasn't anything. You didn't hear any curse words on TV back then. You didn't hear the word bitch or shit or nothing. Now it's like everywhere. You didn't have exposure on your phone to like channels or videos where you could see like murders and like beheadings or crazy, sick, twisted like porn stuff. Like you can watch whatever you want as an adult. I'm not commenting on any of that. I'm not saying it's right or wrong or bad or good or whatever. But there's no way an 11-year-old should be able to see some of the shit that an 11-year-old, even an 8-year-old today can see on their phones. We didn't have any of that. We had such an innocent, our idea of reckless was, again, like if you're smoking a joint and drinking a beer and going to a Van Halen concert, and being an hour late. That was like, oh my God, you're living on the edge. Nowadays it's like, there's so many ways you can get into trouble that we didn't have half of that to deal with. And we weren't bombarded with news and depressing bullshit. We just had a fun time. We were oblivious to all the negativity, and we weren't obsessed with politicians or politics or the news. But I feel like going back to when I worked at 7-Eleven, and I don't know, we just had fun, Atari and video games and just music and going outside and playing and listening to records and buying magazines and going to the record store. We were out in the world doing things. We weren't just like sitting here like we're doing right now watching my video. Yeah, how ironic, right? Watching a video on your phone is okay if you have life balance. There's nothing wrong with watching videos, but you just don't want to be obsessed with stuff. Going back to Circus, Circus magazine was like the second best, I think, rock magazine at the time. If you're not counting like Kerrang, which came later on and stuff. But for me, it was always about Creem and Circus, for the most part. Hit Parader I would buy. But we're gonna get into the title of my video, which is why Creem magazine ruled. We're gonna get into that now. All right, so now why Creem magazine ruled the day back in the day. So for me, Creem was always, my early exposure to Creem magazine was probably when they put out the Kiss Creem Special Edition magazine in 77. I used to go to a newsstand called the Voorhees Tobacco and Newsstand in Jersey. I begged my mom to take me there, probably like once a month or whatever. And it's where I would get my monthly fix of rock magazines and wrestling magazines. Those were like my two big things. And wrestling not so much until like 79, 80, 81, right around that, when I was a little bit older, like 10, 11 years old. For me, it was just about, I remember, you have these memories that you just remember from your childhood vividly. And I can still picture the inside of the store. I can picture the old guy that worked behind the counter, the register. The whole back wall of the newsstand was just one gigantic floor-to-ceiling new magazine section. And you're talking, I don't know, how many feet wide this magazine. It was like, multiple magazine racks stacked next to each other, probably like 6 or 7 of them, if not more. And each one was probably about 5 feet wide. So you're talking like almost like a Barnes and Noble. If you go to a Barnes and Noble, and it's one of the older style Barnes and Nobles that had the magazine racks along the back wall. It was almost that long. Unheard of in the 70s. Most of the time you would pick up a rock magazine at 7-Eleven, or some convenience store, or maybe in a record store, if they had a little magazine rack somewhere with Rolling Stone and whatever. This was like the holy grail. This was like the mecca of magazines, this newsstand. Never saw another one like it anywhere around there. So one day we were in there for some reason, and I walked in the back, and I'm looking at the magazine rack, and I see the Kiss Special Edition. And I was about a year into my Kiss fanaticism at that time in 77. I was probably about 7 or 8 years old. And flipping the fuck out, oh my God, can you buy this for me? My mom or my dad, whoever at the time, I don't remember who it was, bought it for me. And that was I think my real introduction to this magazine called Creem, because Creem was the magazine that put this Kiss magazine out. So obviously I go back to the store, and now I'm looking for this Creem magazine. And, back in 77 into 78, Kiss was constantly on the cover. And so immediately I was a fan. Another thing about Creem magazine, at the time in 74, when they were really getting behind Kiss, they had Kiss come in for a photo session with their staff photographer, a guy named Charlie Auringer, Auringer, I think is how you spell it. And so they did, the Creem used to do these Creem profiles. It's kind of like a parody questionnaire with funny answers and stuff. And so they were doing a photo session for the Kiss one. And so Kiss showed up, and Creem was already like behind Kiss. They had a pretty good relationship with them. And Kiss apparently trusted them because they allowed Charlie to take a shitload of pictures of them in their street clothes without the makeup out in the parking lot. And then they did the photo session with the makeup for the Creem profile. And those pictures were never printed, never leaked, never surfaced anywhere for a good 6 or 7 years. I think it was finally like around 1980 or 81 maybe, when one of them managed to get in the hands of the National Enquirer, and they printed it. And so, which I'll put on the screen. And so, I mean, to Creem's credit, they held their word and kept it under wraps during that whole period from 74 to probably 80, the whole Kiss heyday. They didn't betray them, which was pretty cool. And so it's amazing though that they never leaked. In fact, it's amazing when you look at all the pictures of Kiss that were taken with them without the makeup on in street clothes, like backstage and at sound checks and on airplanes and in airports, and just in their inner circle. There was a lot of pictures taken, and nobody sold any of them. Nobody leaked any of them to the press. I think they realized how it would be like killing the goose that laid the golden egg. They just kept it a mystery for the public, which was really smart. So yeah, some of those pictures I'm dropping in here, and you probably dropped them in already. You'll see some of them, and pretty cool. It's when you look at the picture side by side. I remember seeing that picture when it was printed, and even though they're all wearing sunglasses except for Peter, it was kind of interesting to see that. You just never saw anything like that printed anywhere. And I always thought it was weird. Peter looked like he was wearing like a lady's blouse, like a tube top or something. Like 10 years old. I'm like, that's Peter? What the hell is he wearing? But good stuff. And then there was, at the time, Zeppelin, Queen, Aerosmith, Frampton. Then you get into like 79 and 80. They started putting Cheap Trick, another favorite of mine at the time, AC/DC. Then you started seeing, like, during the boom of like new wave and power pop, you would see the Knack, you would see a lot of Blondie, the Cars, B-52s. I'm trying to think who else. Rockpile, like sometimes just some obscure stuff that you wouldn't expect to see on a cover of a magazine. And they would always do like these special year-end like poll issues and stuff where the people would vote for like their favorite band and their favorite album cover and whatever. But they were very eclectic in their approach as far as types of music that they would cover. Very big on the classic rock, obviously. At the time wasn't classic rock. It's classic rock now, but back then it was just current hard rock. But they would do articles on lesser known bands. You would see articles on like, I don't know, The Sweet, or maybe The Babies, or maybe Angel, occasionally here and there. Angel was more like in Circus than I think they were ever in Creem. But you would see occasionally Rush. But the thing about Creem was their writing was very witty, cutting, funny. Their headlines to all their stories were always like some sort of like tongue-in-cheek, funny sort of headline, making fun of the band or whatever. If I can find some, I'll post some I'll post a couple of pictures of some of the headlines. They were just a very well-rounded, well-written rock magazine. The quality of the photos was always top-notch. They had a mixture of newsprint paper, like Hit Parader was, mixed with glossy color photos spread throughout the whole magazine. The centerfold was always glossy. They had like the Stars of the Cars of the Stars feature where they would have like a rock star posed next to like his, Cadillac or whatever it was. They did a lot of satire. They had great, like a news section in the front 2-page thing, but it was like a 2-page of just little blurbs of what the latest thing was going on with whatever artist. So it'd be like, I don't know, Elvis Costello was in New York City this week, working on tracks for his new record, blah, blah, blah. And then some smart ass comment at the end of it or whatever. But it was a good way to find out what was going on with a lot of different artists in this little short section. And then there was a lot of like pop culture stuff, articles on just lifestyle stuff. A lot of articles on like drug use and pot, and nothing like sports or anything like that. But just they would have a couple of articles on like whatever some sort of pop culture topic was going on at the time. Very rarely politics. They would make fun of politics here and there, but it wasn't It wasn't like Rolling Stone. It wasn't politically driven, trying to make you think one way or whatever. It was kind of like you probably knew where they were coming from most of the time, but they didn't shove it down your throat. It was not like in your face. You came there for music, and that's what you got. And the articles were always interestingly written. They were written like novels. The writers would come up with these like storylines and stories. Hard to explain what I'm talking about, but if you're a fan of Creem magazine, you know that their articles were very cutting edge and just different from every other. It wasn't just question and answers. It wasn't just taking things out of the press release. These guys like Lester Bangs and Robert Duncan, and there were just Jan Uhelski, I think is how you pronounce her last name, who did that famous Kiss article. I was a member of Kiss for one night or something like that, and they dressed her up in a costume and like they all did like this special design makeup on her. This was only a live tour. It was like 2 nights after the Cobo Hall show in May of '75, like in Altoona, PA or something like that. She came out on stage and did Rock and Roll Night with them with like an unplugged guitar or whatever. And so that was like one of the first major stories about Kiss in the magazine. And so, but the writers of the magazine were always very like witty and intelligent and sarcastic, and just a different approach to writing articles. It was not your typical rock magazine in any way, shape, or form at all. And there was always funny like blurbs and like fake like quotations or quote marks under like certain photos. They would just, if the photo had Robert Plant doing something funny next to Jimmy Page, you would see like some sort of funny blurb at the bottom of it, like making like mocking what was in the photo. It was interesting. It was funny and entertaining, and they did great articles on great bands, and it was eclectic. They covered a lot of the stuff that I liked in the late 70s into the early 80s when it came to like the new wave and the power pop stuff, mixed in with like still doing the hard rock stuff. So you would see in the same magazine, the same issue, you would see a cover story on Van Halen, but then right under that was like a 3-page article on Blondie, or I don't know, again, like Rockpile, or like Nick Lowe, or like Graham Parker, maybe Gary Newman or Devo or something. It was like the Ramones. It was they mixed the two in all the time with the same issue. It wasn't just strictly hard rock. It wasn't just strictly punk or new wave. You got a little bit of everything, and they covered a lot of British stuff, kind of like how Trouser Press did, which I think I mentioned. Trouser Press was kind of like the straight version of Creem magazine. The quality of the photos, again, were always good. The record reviews were always very funny and interesting and honest, and sometimes would piss you off because, if they were slamming one of your favorite records or one of your favorite bands, it was not fun to read some of these record reviews, which would really be like biting. But they always did a lot of good, long, in-depth record reviews of the latest records. And I just feel like Creem was the most well-rounded and most entertaining rock magazine. It was like you were getting not just the facts, you were not just getting photos, you were getting a lot of opinion and a lot of fantasy and a lot of humor and a lot of sarcasm, and just by intelligent writers who had a very strong knowledge and history of like rock music and to draw from, as far as references and stuff like that. And I don't know. And then they did all these special edition magazines. You know, they did a couple of them with Van Halen. They did the Kiss ones. They did all of these like rock photo specials. You know, where it was the whole magazine was just like killer like pictures from like the latest tours of whatever artists. And then they would do like a women in rock issue. They used to do a lot of heavy metal specials during the hairband years. So you would get a whole magazine of like nothing but glossy photos and articles on like the current bands, the Rats and the Motley Crues and all that stuff, Twisted Sister, and those were always like, you know, fun to go through. They were just they were just way above everybody else in like every respect. You know, and that's just my opinion. Other people might have preferred Circus. A lot of people probably read Creem and didn't get it. You know, like this, it's kind of either went over their head or it pissed them off. Maybe it upset them. Maybe there was too much inside joke stuff in Circus. Like if you read in Creem, if you read Creem regularly, there was a lot of inside jokes and a lot of things. Yeah, the mailbag section in Creem was always hysterical because I could never tell whether they were written by the editors of the magazine or if they were legitimate letters mixed in. I think some people started getting in on the joke and knew that if they wrote in a letter that was really like bizarre or funny or twisted, that it was going to get printed. So a lot of people were probably just doing that. And the responses to the letters from the editors were always funny. You know, it was a very much a tongue-in-cheek approach to rock journalism. And so you got a lot of things out of Creem magazine that you just didn't get out of Circus or Hit Parader at the time. Definitely not Rolling Stone. So I feel like that's, for me, Creem magazine always resonated. It checked like all the boxes. And they were also a very big supporter of all the bands that I loved. You know, I mean, my favorite bands at that time were Kiss, Cheap Trick, Van Halen, and AC/DC. And I started getting into like, you know, I liked a lot of other stuff too, but they were like my four big bands from 76 on, starting with Kiss and then eventually Cheap Trick and whatever. So anyway, those four bands were always very prominently featured in Creem magazine, constantly. On the cover, full-blown stories, centerfolds, whatever. So I was a loyal fan to the magazine all the way up until probably about 84, 85. When I gradually stopped buying it when they started kind of getting more into printing articles about like, I don't know, REM and U2 and the Bangles and stuff like that. I would buy it once in a while, but I wasn't loyal to it every single month like I was during the heyday. At this point, I think I have nearly every issue of Creem magazine from like 71, 72 up until about like 83, 84, like a 10, 12-year stretch there. I have some sporadic issues here and there, the real early ones and the ones that were like more in the mid-80s. But that like little 10 to 12-year stretch, I think I have pretty much every single issue. I'd have to look and go through. I think maybe I'm missing one or two, but I think I made it a point to try to get every issue that I could from that golden period. Probably 73 to like 83 really is the biggest, the most favorite period of the magazine of mine. I actually contributed to the Creem documentary that came out a few years ago on DVD. They did a GoFundMe campaign for it, and if you contributed a certain amount of money to it, you got an early copy of the documentary on DVD and some swag, like bumper stickers and T-shirts, blah blah blah, whatever. And what's kind of cool is if you contributed X amount of money to the project, you had your name listed in the credits as a contributor to the project. So as somebody who grew up as a kid buying Creem magazine every month and just being a huge supporter, and in fact, if you can see, I have the Creem magazine logo tattooed on my arm. I don't know if you can see it. Let's see if I can get it in there. It's kind of blurry now because it was like done a little while ago, but it's right there amongst The Who and Alice Cooper and all kinds of stuff. Van Halen. You know, I mean, I got the logo tattooed on my freaking arm. It doesn't get much more hardcore than that, I guess, you know. But I don't know. It's kind of neat. I feel like it's kind of cool that I grew up buying the magazine, and my name is on the credits on the documentary to the magazine. It's kind of neat. Like if you told me when I was like, 10 years old that would be the case, I probably would be pretty flipped out by that. If you get a chance to watch the documentary, I highly recommend it. It's awesome. It goes into much more detail about the magazine than I can in this video. Obviously, I'm trying to keep my videos some sort of reasonable length. There's just a lot of stuff in that documentary that it covers that I just don't cover in this video. That if you're a fan of the magazine, it's absolutely worth watching. It just reinforces everything that I've been saying about the magazine in this video. So check it out if you get a chance. So yeah, that is my discussion on rock magazines from the 70s and 80s. I'm sure there are a few that maybe I forgot about. If you have anything you want to put in the comments, maybe your personal ranking or favorite rock magazines, maybe there's a few I forgot about that you want to mention, give a shout out to. I'm going to put at the end here a quick ranking of all of my, my magazine favorites from that time frame in order from one to whatever. Just my personal opinion. Again, it's all about your personality and what you find entertaining and what you don't, what you find interesting and what you don't. Not everybody's the same. So this is just my personal viewpoint on what I thought were the best magazines of the time. And I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please hit the subscribe button on the screen and check out one of my other latest videos. And we'll see you soon. Take care. Deep dives and rankings of album, pop culture discussion, classic old school wrestling, some drums, and whatever the hell I feel like. So if you enjoy any of that sort of stuff, if you like podcasts by Rick Beato, Three Sides of the Coin, The Contrarians, Billy Corgan, stuff like that, please check out my channel, Tom Stewart Drums on YouTube, and subscribe. I hope to see you there.